In the leftist and liberal lexicon, nationalism is believed to be driven by hate. They believe that racial and ethnic differences are arbitrary, just the result of a process of otherization, and so nationalism itself has no real reason to naturally exist. That being the case, then the only logical reason a person would want to have an exclusive nation for his own people is if he were incensed to hate another group of people. This is basically an exclusionary dialectic of nationalism, a nationalism of pure negativity. Of course, being hateful is bad, and loving people is good. If nationalism is based on hate, then why should anyone be a nationalist? The truth, however, is that this paradigm is incorrect, and it's largely a straw man. Its first error is in assuming that the existence of races and ethnicities is baseless and arbitrary, and that they form through a socially conditioned process of otherization. In reality, racial groups have biological reality, and ethnicities have kinship reality based on ancestry and familial relationships. Your race is your extended family, and you're always going to be more related to someone who is the same race as you. And yes, this is true. There's some race nominalists who try to post this study on et al. 2009 as proof that people are more related to people of another race than their own, but the study actually still shows that Europeans are more related to other Europeans than to, say, Asians. And if I recall correctly, members of the same race are about as related to each other as fifth cousins, so your race almost literally is your extended family. The family is a natural hierarchy into which we're born, and no matter where you go, the concept of family is pretty much always the same. Organic governments, like let's say feudalism, or even libertarianism, if that actually existed, are organized on the basis of family. Villages were organized around families, and we're of course familiar with the concept of family-run businesses. Family is a basic biosocial reality that we're all familiar with, and it is the very basis for race and ethnicity. Nations thusly are not so much formed by otherization as they naturally spring up around common kinship groups. Throughout history, it has of course been normal for families to value their own kin more than others, and partly this is because parents have a direct responsibility to their children for having brought them into the world. The order of charity springs from this fact as well as from the principle of love. We obviously are going to be more likely to love people more related to us than otherwise. What a nation state or an ethno-state really is, then, isn't just exclusionary, rather it is a positive expression of kinship and the unity of family, history, and ancestry. The true dialectic of nationalism is the dialectic of love for one's own, which already sets up a subjective hierarchy of peoples where one's own sits at the top. I'll call this the kinship dialectic of nationalism. Many leftists and liberals like Pavlou, because they believe in the exclusionary dialectic of nationalism, are inured to believe that nationalism is synonymous with genocide. Since they think nationalism is born from intense hatred of the other, they have to view it as aggressive ethno-narcissism and supremacism. This is why they continue to perceive nationalism as dangerous or immoral, and why they think that nationalism is antithetical to love. They believe that nationalists place other races below their own because they really want to dominate or eradicate them out of a sense that other races are inferior or worthless. In truth, however, nationalism has existed and can exist in the future without any need to imperialize or genocide other races or ethnic groups. The notion that one's own people should be privileged or to have the exclusive right to exist inside that people's own territory on the basis of kinship is not the same as to declare that one's own race is superior to others. Rather, it's a statement of moral closeness, righteousness of principle, and responsibility. Other races need not be considered in their own individual territories. Simply because they are loved less than one's own kin does not mean that they must be hated. Hence, nationalism is not fundamentally a dialectic of hate. No genocide is necessary. The moral precepts of our nationalism can even be extended to every group of people, as I have done elsewhere and just as the differentialists have done. It's good for every people to have their own homeland where they can express their own unique ways of life. What's hateful about that? Of course, nationalism must be enforced, and what the practical enforcement of nationalism has to look like, where we have a pluralistic society, is either going to be self-segregation and secessionism or forced relocation of foreigners. Pavlou contended that this would be a case of totalitarianism But actually, states have had the right to control immigration and demographics for thousands of years. Controlling immigration and demographics is, in fact, one of the primary functions of the state, and you can find constitutions of very liberal nations like Mexico enshrining a demographic majority of a nation's race into law. Forced relocation is an authoritarian measure, sure, but it isn't totalitarian. Totalitarianism is total control of a population's behavior, and usually it's enforced through the creation of a climate of suspicion. In the Soviet Union, you had to watch every word you spoke, and there would be informants and secret police everywhere. Surveillance is an important part of a totalitarian society, as well as state enforcement of things as minute as art and culture. But mass relocation does not require suspicion nor mass surveillance to effectuate, since it can simply be carried out on the basis of a census. And yes, this is perfectly compatible with the kinship dialectic of nationalism. The idea of the multiracial society is akin to the demand that all families are required to allow other families to live in their households, and that family preferences have to come to an end. What would be more destructive to kinship than to declare immoral the privileged bonds between members of the same family and house? The leftist distaste for nationalism fundamentally stems from their skepticism or outright rejection of the family. One historical version of this leftist attitude is the Jewish kibbutzim, basically collective farms. They would take the children from their parents on birth and then communally raise them and educate them in collective schools. Modern public schooling is basically a softer version of the kibbutzim idea. Karl Marx argued that the family is a bourgeois institution and ought to be abolished. The postmodern proponents of the sexual revolution constantly try to promote quote-unquote alternative lifestyles, such as polyamory, that further disintegrate the family, getting close to achieving Marx's aims. The liberal variant of this distaste comes from a general universalist attitude toward people, ideas, and things. They don't like to make distinctions based on groups, and instead like to treat all humans as identical atoms, even though this is obviously not true in reality. This also effectively undermines the basis for family values. Since kinship implies preferential treatment and in-group privileges, it is essentially inegalitarian. So liberals, by opposing all in-group preferences, essentially end up unconsciously joining forces with the leftists in the destruction of the family, which by extension is also the destruction of the race. This attitude isn't just empty conjecture, because there is some empirical evidence that leftists see the family this way. A 2019 paper by Ravi Iyer and Jonathan Haidt found that liberals have more moral concern for inanimate objects, or the universe, than they do for their own family, while conservatives are more parochial and care more for their family than anything or anyone else. It's this universalism at the root of leftist and liberal thinking that fundamentally undermines the nation, and it prevents them from seeing nationalism the same way that we do. They fundamentally do not have a strong kinship feeling, and since they lack that, they also don't seem to understand why we care so much about having an exclusive state for our race. They just see that our in-group preference violates universalism and then accuse us of hatred. They don't understand that in-group preference is actually an expression of the deepest love and in no way implies supremacy.